Barja Falcha. Welcome to today's talk with Philippe Sands, which is part of this year's special online Virutal Féile, brought to you by Phil and Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. The chances are, if you've got this far and tuned in, you know who Philippe Sands is, but it's a sort of a convention whereby I should tell you who he is. Philippe Sands is a British and French lawyer. He's a barrister at Matrix Chambers and a professor at University College London. And already, if I start telling you this, you get the sense that I got from going online that the man must have cloned himself at some time or other, because he's a specialist in international law, and as such, he's acted as a counsel in more than 24 cases at the International Court of Justice. He's been active on issues about Chile, Guantanamo Bay, Congo, and Iraq. He's acted for the Solomon Islands in relation to nuclear weapons, for Georgia in relation to Russian intervention, for Australia in relation to whaling. He has represented Mauritius as regards the plight of the Chagos archipelago. I think that's probably the most recent one I've heard of. The most recent one I've heard of is where he has acted for the Gambia in relation to a case of genocide brought against Myanmar because of their treatment of the Rohingya people. He's an author of 17 books, including the one where I first got to know of him. I'm sorry it's mirrored, but this is the one that I'm talking about, East-West Street, published in 2016. This book mesmerized me. It's like a history book. It's a legal textbook. It's a legal history book. It's a detective story. It's a cultural masterpiece. And most of all, most tenderly, it's a family history about what happened to a number of Philippe's, quite a few dozen of Philippe's family in the Holocaust. If it was up to me, I would probably spend the rest of the time now talking about that book, because it seriously blew me away. I'm not saying the next one didn't, but we're here today to talk about his most recent book, published earlier this year, called Ratline. Sorry, I showed you the wrong one there. Ratline, that's Ratline. Love, Lies and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive. I'll not tell you any more about it, other than to say, sit back, enjoy yourselves. You're about to be treated to a wonderful, moving, and scintillating story. Philippe, over to you.
Bill, thank you so much. And as we've already agreed, next year in Belfast.
Okay.
You didn't mention one of my favourite cases, which is the case I acted for Ireland for many years against the United Kingdom in relation to Sellafield, where we managed to close down the mixed oxide plant eventually, but we can talk about that on another occasion.
Okay.
Let's talk the Ratline. The Ratline is a sort of companion to East-West Street. It's not a sequel. You don't have to have read East-West Street to get there, but they're connected in this sense. East-West Street is the story of four men. One is my grandfather, Leon. Another is a couple of guys who invented the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide. And the fourth man, who's very connected to the Ratline, is Hans Frank, who was Adolf Hitler's lawyer from 1928 to 1933 and went on to become Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. In writing East-West Street, which began with a visit to the faraway Ukrainian city of Lviv, I accepted an invitation to give a lecture on the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide, but I really went to find the house where my grandfather was born. It was a book about identity, I suppose, in a way. I wanted to know more about my grandfather. I knew him well. He died only in 1997. But he never talked to me about the pre-war years, so I never knew about his life in Lviv or Lemberg. Anyway, I found the house, one thing led to another, and I came across the identity of the man who arrived in my grandfather's city in 1942, gave a speech at the university to announce the extermination of the region's entire Jewish population. My grandfather had left by then, but he left behind a large family, about 80 people, and all of them were killed following the speech given by Hans Frank. And I started writing in East-West Street about Hans Frank, and I researched as I would do a case before international court. I read books, I call people, I get to meet them. And one of the people that I met through a book he'd written called The Father was the son of Hans Frank, Nicholas Frank, who, to be honest, has become a friend. He's on the other side of the story, but we're both bound by the legacy of conflict which is, of course, one of the reasons making me so interested in do this conversation and so keen as always to be connected to or in Belfast. And I like Nicholas very much. And at one point, Nicholas said to me, you know, Philippe, you're interested in the city of Lviv. Maybe you ought to meet the son of my father's deputy, who was the governor of Lviv. His name was Otto Wächter, and he was my dad's deputy. So I said, sure, I'd like to meet the son. What's he called? He's called Horst. This is about 2011. And Nicholas says, okay, I'll introduce you. The introductions are made. Horst invites us to come and visit him in his old, broken down castle. It sounds grander than it is. He lives in total poverty. And we went and I met Horst Wächter, who was at that point about 70 years old. And we talked about his dad. And as Nicholas Frank had said, he's different from me. Nicholas Frank, you have to understand, despises his father. The very first thing he said to me when I met him, literally in Hamburg by the river, was, Philippe, you need to understand I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father, which was quite an opening. Horst was different. Unlike Nick, Horst really looked for the good in his father. His father had basically done the same things. He had been an early Nazi. He'd beaten up Jews and political opponents. He'd been involved in the killing of the Austrian Chancellor in 1934, Engelbert Dollfuss. He'd fled to Germany. He'd worked in the same office as Adolf Eichmann and Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. And in 1938, he returned to Austria after the German occupation, the Anschluss, and got a high-ranking job removing political opponents and Jews from public office, including his own teachers at the university. And from that, he carried on up the greasy pole. In 1939, he was sent to Krakow, where he became a governor of the district of Krakow. He built the Krakow ghetto, he persecuted, he killed. And in 1942, he was sent to the district of Galicia, to the city of Lemberg, where in August he welcomed Hans Frank, who announced the extermination of the entire Jewish population, 500,000 people, of the district. In 1944, the Red Army occupied Lemberg, District of Galicia, and he fled to Berlin and spent the last months of the war in Italy, from where he fled in the spring of 1945, made his way back to Austria. And on the day the war ended, he disappeared off the face of the earth. That was what I knew about Otto Wächter when I met his son Horst. I liked Horst. I didn't share his views of his father. His view was that his father was essentially a decent man, that he'd struggled to find the good in his father, and he did it to honor his mother, to whom he was very close. The mother is called Charlotta, and in many ways she's the beating heart of the book, the Ratline. So that takes you up to the point where I first met Horst. One thing led to another. I wrote a profile for the Financial Times. That led to a film commission from the BBC, and then a podcast. And I spent 10 years working with Horst. At a certain point, Nicholas, on camera, in an interview for the film we made, suggested that Horst might be a new kind of Nazi, which actually I disagreed with, and Horst, when he saw the film, was very upset about. And Horst said to me, what can I do, Philippe, to prove that I'm not a Nazi? And I said, well, you've got this incredible archive. You've got these letters and diaries, thousands of pages. I've seen a few pages, but thousands and thousands of pages I haven't. Why don't you give all the material to a museum, and then researchers and members of the public can look at the material and form their own view as to the decency or not of your father, the good things he did, the not so good things he did, the bad things he did, and the role of your mother. He said, terrific idea. University in Washington scanned all the material, and Horst very generously said, would you like a copy of the USB? And I said, I'd love a copy of the USB. By now, we're about 2015. And the USB arrives in a tatty brown envelope through my letterbox. I put it in the computer, and it's literally unbelievable. From the moment Charlotta and Otto met in April 1929 until the moment he died in July 1949, 10,000 pages of letters, diaries, tape recordings, photographs, an unbelievable treasure trove. And it opened the door to an investigation I could not have imagined. I'd mentioned earlier that on the 8th of May 1945, he disappeared off the face of the earth, literally. He reappeared 4.5 years later on a mortuary slab of a hospital in Rome run by the Vatican, the Santo Spiritu Hospital, dead, described by his wife as black as a Negro. What happened to Otto Wächter? That's the second part of the book. And that reads more like a detective story and a thriller as I seek to uncover the competing theories. Horst is convinced that his father was poisoned, either by the Americans or the Jews or the Poles or the Soviets. The other view is that he died because of an illness caught while swimming in the River Tiber or at Lake Albano near Castel Gandolfo. Take your pick. I try to uncover what I can about things that happened 70 years ago. There's a lot to talk about. At its beating heart, it's a love story, but it's also a book about mass murder and a book about the Cold War. It is the story of a legacy. What happens when things that happened long ago re-emerge after 6 and 7 decades, and you want to find out what's happened. That's the story of the Ratline, so called because as he died, Otto Wächter was hoping to get to Argentina on the same path as Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele and Erich Priebke and others, the path known as the Ratline. That's the book in a nutshell.
That is a nutshell. I mean, we're talking, what are we talking? 400 pages.
Yeah, not 10,000, Bill.
400 pages in 20 minutes, folks. Where would you get it? Here's the thing, Otto, that is the briefest of did I say Otto? Philippe. That is the briefest of outlines of the book. I must say, although we are talking about this book, you did introduce the other one as well. They're quite different for all that they do seem to be in the same territory. And one difference I think is this. The first book was much more personal, right? Because your family story and your family, the death of your family was interwoven intimately with the main protagonist in that book. This one is a little bit more distant, but your story's still in there, right? And it seems to me you've already displayed it there. Here you're talking about Otto, whom Nick thinks is still a Nazi. And I have to say, you didn't totally convince me. I think I might be closer to Nick on the basis of reading the book. But you're remarkably warm about him. This is a man who is justifying what his father did, which included the overseeing of the death of thousands of Jews in the city where your grandmother and the rest of the family lived. And you seem to rate him as a friend. Was that easy for you to do? Are you just a naturally nice person, or what is it?
I think we have to be really clear. One thing that you said there, Bill, I think is not an accurate representation. The thing about Horst that you've got to understand is he's not a Holocaust denier. He says it happened. Millions of Jews and others were killed. Point one. Point two, he accepts that his dad was involved as a senior person. Okay? But he says, my dad was a decent guy, and if he was involved because he was part of the system. And although his father was indicted for mass murder, crimes against humanity and genocide, he was never caught. He was therefore never put on trial and never convicted. And Horst looks me in the eye and says, you're a lawyer. As far as you're concerned, you've got to accept my father died an innocent man and a decent man. So just unpacking that story, of course, there's multiple levels of complexity. And it's multiple levels that you, sitting in Belfast, will be very familiar with, as familiar as anyone. How do you unpick the involvement of individuals in things that may not have been good, where they escape formal justice? Horst's position is my father was essentially a decent man, and there is no evidence that he ever killed anyone or ordered any killing or did anything. And part of my effort is to show that that is wrong, and it is wrong. And I find the documents, and I even find photographs of Otto Wächter supervising an international crime, the execution of 50 young Polish boys and men. A really shocking set of images, which I've put in the book, because they needed to be put in the book, because I showed them to Horst. So Horst's position is complex. He's not a Nazi. He's not a denier of the Nazi atrocities. He's not a denier of a certain involvement of his father in those things. What he doesn't accept is that his father acted criminally. And that's where he and I part company. And the question that I'm challenged with is, where does that leave him? By his denial of the complicity of his father, is he himself in some way complicit? Is he justifying the acts of his father? And the answer to that is no, he doesn't justify the acts of his father. He says that the things that happened to my family, so it is pretty personal, the things that happened to millions of others should not have happened. But his father's involvement in the circumstances that gave rise to those events do not, in Horst's view, make him a criminal. I disagree with that. And of course, the complexity of your question is, does that mean that because I disagree, I should just cut him off, have nothing more to do with him, and rid him out of my life? And I haven't been able to do that. Why? Because I've come to understand that Horst, in his own way, is a victim of what happened. His world collapsed when he was 6 years old. He grew up in a stable family of plenty. And then in 1945, the war came to an end, his side lost, and his life collapsed. And he has spent the rest of his life trying to reconstitute the childhood that he looks back with, with so much happiness and fondness. And that's why I have empathy for him. Mm. I am not in the presence of a Holocaust denier or a denier of mass murder. I'm in the presence of an elderly gentleman who is struggling to come to terms with his own demons. And at a human level, I feel an empathy towards him and a protectiveness towards him.
Okay, that's well explained, and thank you for putting me in my place. I did get that point from the book, and I do get your point. I suppose the only hesitation I have is his notion, it's not a denial, but his notion that his dad was only in there in the upper echelons to stop worse things happening. And you didn't find any evidence of that.
No. I mean, look, I went through 10,000 pages of documents, and if I had found a shred of anything, it would be in the book. I promised Horst to be faithful to the facts. I'm a courtroom lawyer. I had a responsibility to him. I honor my responsibilities. If I'd found a line of someone he helped, if I'd found a passage, nothing. What I did find was oversight of mass killing. What I did find was lots of articulations of why we have to do this to the Jews. What I did find in his mother's writings and diaries is not a single expression during the war or in the 40 years she lived after the war of any regret about anything that happened. And that is pretty shocking. Horst accepts that. He doesn't find anything that I have been unable to find. And still he cannot accept. And the reason for that is that his mother, Charlotte, has constructed this account of her husband, of his father. And I think through his veneration of his mother, he has created this narrative that allows him basically to get through each day. I mean, one of the hearts of this story, which will be very familiar to you, is what does complicity mean? What is your responsibility as a human being if you see bad things happening, or if you're told about bad things that happened in the past but involved your own family member, your beloved father, your beloved mother? Do you say, no, it didn't happen, no, they weren't involved? I understand that reluctance of a child to find the bad in what their parent has done. I think any human being would understand that. The question is, at what point does Horst's denial of the facts constitute a form of complicity? That's the question, the moral question we have to think about.
Yeah. Well, he is surely a complex character. And I think that, for example, for someone who does not have the involvement that you have personally in the story, I find somebody like Nick, who only plays a small part in this book, Nick more understandable in that he rejects his dad outright for the man that he was, the Nazi he was. It reminds me, and I can't remember who it was, but a son and daughter of one of the leading Nazis who migrated to Australia afterwards, and both had themselves sterilized so that they would never continue that gene sort of thing. Yeah. And it's this sense that, it must be really difficult being the child of somebody like that to not think that somehow there was a gene of monstrosity in the family, and that you were somehow going to end up with it as well.
Totally. I grew up on one side of a complex story, and any conflict zone lives with this. The book East-West Street in particular, I think Ratline looks like it'll be the same, has been picked up around the world. I've done events in many, many conflict zones, in Europe, in South America, in Africa, in Asia. And it resonates because it's a theme that is a universal theme. It's one of the reasons I think the East-West Street did well in Ireland and in Northern Ireland was precisely because it evokes issues that are very relevant in many different communities in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And it will be the same with the Ratline. In writing it, and in writing East-West Street, I came to know people who are on the other side of the story from my own story. And a sort of regular type of default position is to sort of swat them away and say, they're on the bad side, they're on the other side. But I felt I had a responsibility to understand and to engage, to talk, to work out a relationship. And it meant that I became very close friends with Nicholas Frank. Who would have imagined that I could call the son of the man who basically was hanged at Nuremberg for the killing of my grandfather's entire family, 80 people. He's my friend. Absolutely. He is my friend. That's what 70 years does, where people address things with an open mind. We sit together, we have our arms around each other, we have a few vodkas, we laugh. He's not responsible for what his dad did. He has engaged with it. The relationship with Horst is different. It's not like the relationship with Nicholas. I'm agreeing with you. My deep, heartfelt empathy is with the one who has truly recognized the horrors of what happened. But in a curious way, if you put the two men together, I think Nicholas's life is harder than Horst's. In a sense, Horst has taken the easier route. And I think my experience from dealing with conflict zones around the world is that Horst's route is the common route, or the more common route. Horst's route is the easier one for people to follow. And I often ask myself, what if my dad had been hanged or accused of the murder of 500,000 people or 4 million people? Would I love my dad? Would I hate my dad? Would I embrace my dad? Would I reject my dad? What would you do? And what these two books, and what the Ratline in particular has caused me to do, is to reach across the divide and try to understand and try to build bridges, because that's the only way you can do these things going forward. But at times it's not easy, and at times I lost my rag and I didn't like that. But generally it's been good-natured and it's been fine.
Philippe, I get that entirely. I think there's a sense in which our human nature is to believe that such things that happen are created by monsters. And it's only when circumstances change that you sometimes can say that somebody that you thought was a monster, or indeed a whole group of people that you thought were monsters, maybe were more complex than you thought. I've seen that myself with some of my work going on in relation to the peace process here, where I managed to be able to talk to and indeed become friends with people I could never imagined not to the extent that you have, but that I could never imagine. But can I, at the risk of being a little bit too provocative here, and tell me off if you want to.
No, not at all.
Let me switch from Horst to Otto. And I'm thinking of a parallel. I'm thinking of Hannah Arendt and what happened with Hannah Arendt when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she as a Jewish person, got grief from a lot of Jewish people in her native New York in particular, that she didn't paint Eichmann as a monster, right? Now, what would you say to the accusation that you don't paint Otto as a monster? Whatever else he was, you don't paint him as a monster.
No, I don't. I paint him as a human being who did some monstrous things, but he was also capable of showing love and affection. He was a dad. He was a husband. He was a lover. He was a friend. He was a son. And he did honorable and decent things as well as doing terrible things. And I think life is not absolutely black and white. It is complex. And do I venerate and respect Otto Wächter? No, I do not. Shortly before the book was published, one of his grandchildren reached out to me, because there is an element of the Ratline which is different from East-West Street and takes place in Rome, in the Vatican. And parts of the Wächter family are deeply religious Catholics. And one of the grandsons reached out to me and said, could I ask you to do one thing before you publish this book? Could you please publicly forgive my grandfather? And I thought about it, and I wrote back and I said, what you're asking is a very big thing. I don't feel able to do that for the reasons that are set out in the book, but I'm really willing to talk to you about this. In fact, I've been helped in writing the book by some very fine people in the Vatican. Why don't we travel together to the Vatican and let's have a conversation with some of these bishops and cardinals about what happened and what is our responsibility to engage with these things. And I didn't get a reply, which was interesting for me. I mean, I did not expect to be contacted by the grandson and asked to do that. It sort of came out of the blue. But equally, I didn't expect in doing the research that I would gain access to parts of the Vatican that were, totally new to me. I wanted to find the room. Well, I found the room. I wanted to see the room in which Otto Wächter died. Like doing a case, you've got to go to the site where things have happened because you sense things, you see things, you spot, you observe. And I couldn't get access to it until a Spanish writer who was giving a lecture in the Vatican for the culture department went down there, met a bishop who was the number 2 in the culture department. Somehow my name came up. The bishop said, Philippe Sands, didn't you make that podcast called The Ratline? And my friend Javier Cercas said he did. And the bishop, an Irish bishop, said, I shouldn't say this, not very complimentary about the Vatican, but I loved the podcast. I want to meet him. And I went down the next day. And he gave me access to places I would not have imagined. I saw the grave of Bishop Alois Hudal, the Austrian bishop who helped various Nazis escape to South America along the Ratline. Not in my eyes a holy, cuddly and lovely person. And while I was doing an equivalent conversation to this in New Zealand, a person phoned in to a radio show and said, this is incredible for me to be listening to this story of Alois Hudal helping Nazis on the run, because this is my story. This is an elderly New Zealand lady who says, my father, she says, was a general, was a soldier. He became a general in the New Zealand army, and he was a prisoner of war in Germany in 1944. He escaped. He made his way to Rome, and his life was saved by Bishop Hudal. In other words, Hudal did good things and did not so good things. He wasn't just a monster. He did monstrous things. And I think that's what I've come to understand about life. you have to look at everything with open eyes. Now, that doesn't mean that when someone like Otto Wächter, who was involved in the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people for which he was indicted, that you just give him a chip and you exonerate him from those horrors. Absolutely not. And I don't do that in the book. But it does mean you've got to tell the story in a rounded way.
So let me get this right. Giúdach also helped Allied soldiers who'd been prisoners and had escaped, helped them get back home.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And that story has partly been told and has partly been utilized to soften the hard edges of that part of his story where he is well known, notorious. He lost his job for helping the most senior Nazis escape to South America.
The Ratline that you're talking about, as far as I know, it went from Rome to Genoa to mostly Argentina. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you're mentioning Giúdach here. In a funny sort of way, your story is so caught up in recounting what this family is about that it's not everything you want to know about how the Ratline operated and who all the personnel were and everybody else. I know this has been done in fiction and in factual stuff by other people, but could you tell us a little bit more about the Ratline? How did it work? How high did the support and authorization for it go in the Vatican? Was it one rogue bishop or what was it?
Right. So the Ratline describes what is called by senior SS officers the Reich migratory route. And it was the path exactly as you described it in geographic terms, from Italy, from Rome up to Genoa, and then by boat, usually to Argentina, but also Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, various other places. It was done by very high-end support on the South American end. In terms of what happened in Italy, it's a very complex story. We know for fact that a number of senior Vatican bishops were involved. What remains unknown is the precise role of Pope Pius XII. As we know, Pope Francis has recently opened the archive of the Pius XII papacy, and so over time, but I think it will take years rather than months, more will come to be known. There is some evidence that Pius XII provided small sums of monies to help Bishop Giúdach, who had been very close to him in the 30s and the early 40s. Giúdach was known as the Nazi bishop, the one who wanted a rapprochement between the National Socialists and the Catholic Church. And he was very close to Pius XII, or Pacelli as the Secretary of State was known in the 1930s, but they drifted apart. And in the end, in 1952, he lost his job once Italian newspapers started telling the story of what he had done. And one has to assume he lost his job with the support of Pius XII. So there was some support, but we don't know the details of how much. But equally interesting is how the Nazi migratory route ran. And one of the things that I came across in writing the book, really astonished me. Otto Wächter escapes in May 45. He disappears off the face of the earth. In fact, I learn through all this material and through talking to Horst that he befriends a young Waffen-SS soldier, Burkhard Ratman, who is a SS soldier who has learned how to survive in high mountain terrains, above 2,000 meters. And Ratman takes Wächter up into the Austrian mountains where they hide for 3.5 years. I meet Ratman, unbelievably, in 2017. He's still alive, and he tells me the whole story. It was extraordinary. In late 48, Ratman decides to go home, leaves Wächter alone. Wächter goes to Salzburg and then makes his way to Italy. He arrives in Rome in April 49 with the help of Charlotte Wächter. And he is then parked in a monastery, the Vigna Pia Monastery, Vatican run, and looked after, lives in a monk's cell. And he thinks he's being hunted. What he doesn't know is that the Americans have created an anti-Soviet, an anti-Bolshevik spy network, which is being run out of Rome, and which is run by one of Wächter's former comrades in the SS, Karl Haas. Karl Haas is the chief agent of a network of 8 US spies. Who are the 8 spies? 3 of them are former SS intelligence officers. 3 are members of the Italian Fascist Party, one of them the Secretary General who is in prison, and the other 2 are senior Vatican officials. One of the Vatican officials who was a paid American spy, $50 a month for 5 years in cash, was Bishop Alois Giúdach, who reported to the Americans everything he knew. The other one, even more remarkably, is the chief spokesperson of the Vatican, of the Pope. Cardinal was an American spy. So I was stunned to discover that the Americans were all over the Ratline, the fascists were all over the Ratline, the Vatican was all over the Ratline. Everyone knew what was going on, and the Ratline essentially became a recruiting tool to take on the new enemy. Now, I was so flummoxed and surprised by all of this that I got in touch with a neighbor of mine who happens to be a writer of spy thrillers focusing on Cold War period. His name is John le Carré, David Cornwall. And I've known him for 20 years. He's, we go to the pub together around the corner, and he's my neighbor. So I went to see him to find out, could this be true? Is this really happening? And he floored me. He said, Philippe, this is amazing material, but it's amazing for me because I was there in 1949. I said, what do you mean you were there in 1949? He said, because in 1949, I was an 18-year-old British soldier, and I was involved in interrogating German prisoners. For what purpose, I asked? To punish them, to find out which ones to put on trial. He said no, to recruit them. And he said it was very confusing because he had grown up being told the Nazis were the worst thing in the world, and all of a sudden they were our friends. I had to turn on a sixpence, he told me, and it was very, very confusing. So the story of Otto Wächter takes you into the dirtiest and filthiest of places. Nothing is ever quite what it seems.
It is incredible. That was a part of the book that really blew my mind as well. It reminds me of supposed conversation once between some big scientists from the Soviet Union and from the United States where the United States guy said, in relation to the moon, rockets to the moon, our scientists are better than your scientists. And the Russian replied, no, your Germans are better than our Germans. That notion that they took what they could out of the ruins of the Reich.
We knew they'd done it. I knew they'd done it in relation to scientists who were sort of thought to be non-political. But the idea that they would do it in relation to senior SS intelligence officers, including people who had been indicted for mass murder, for crimes against humanity and genocide, blew me away, frankly, blew me away.
That brings us well beyond your book, and so you may want to either refuse the question or cut it really short, but it makes me wonder about, was this a one-off instance in terms of a victory over the vanquished to try to take their best intelligence people, etc., spies? Has it gone on elsewhere? More to the point, does it still go on?
A very loaded question from the place in which you are sitting right now. Who knows? I would be amazed if it doesn't go on. I would be amazed if around us are not the most unexpected recruits in London, in Belfast, in many other places around the world. That is what people do. The establishment is an all-powerful thing. And when it needs help and when it can fund that help, it will turn to those it needs to turn to. And I don't know about you, but my wife certainly tells me that I am prone to believe that certain people around me are in some way connected with the world of spookery. And I do believe that. I do think that there are quite a few people around who are not only what they seem. And I do exercise a degree of caution with some people. So in short, yeah, I think they're all around.
It's a bit of a rabbit hole you can't afford to go down too far because it's endless. But I mean, I can see the point of paranoia, but more to the point, how should I say this? Knowing the things that you know, seeing the things that you've seen as an international human rights lawyer, why do you not end up a total skeptic and a total cynic? I mean, people that don't know you, seeing you here now, are going to say, yeah, he's a nice guy. He doesn't seem completely screwed up. He's got a sense of humor. He's got a sensitivity about him. You know, it's an awful world out there, as part of your book shows.
It's an awful world, but it's also a wonderful world. That's the amazing thing about life. And the trick in writing these two books was to capture that. I'm not starry-eyed about the world, okay? I've seen some terrible things. I've seen a lot of mass graves. I know what human beings are capable of doing to each other. They are capable of doing the most terrible things imaginable. And yet, there is always or often a silver lining. There's a crack of light that somehow penetrates. And that happens enough in my life. So last December, for example, I found myself in a really strange situation. One of the cases that you mentioned, the case for the Gambia against Myanmar, a case about the Genocide Convention, which the origins of which are at the heart of East-West Street, the first book. And I was counsel, for the Gambia against Myanmar, alleged to be committing atrocities against the Rohingya Muslim community. And I found myself arguing the case in the International Court of Justice in the Peace Palace, sitting 2 meters from my opponent, Aung San Suu Kyi, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 or wherever it was, and arguing to defend what the military of Myanmar was doing to the Rohingya, unable to refer to the community as the Rohingya. She calls them, the Muslims of Rakhine State, unable to use the word rape or sexual assault in relation to members of her own country, citizens of her own country. And I thought, warts and all, the world is imperfect, but here we are in a court of justice, in an international court of justice, talking about accountability for crimes that are being committed on a terrible scale, and she is having to justify herself in front of a court of law. If nothing else, it has increased her accountability, it has increased her exposure, and one of the things that I believe in is that justice and the idea of justice is a long game, and it's an uneven and crooked path. But there are enough chinks of light to allow me to maintain my optimistic disposition, but I'm not starry-eyed.
You have me thinking of Leonard Cohen, that great line, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in.
Possibly the greatest line ever written.
Isn't it?
It is. It is. Indeed, if you listen to a particular version of that, you may even have the album live in London, recorded in 2009. Go to track 9, which is the song Anthem, which has the line, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And as the song begins, you will hear Leonard having an exchange with some nutter in the front row, shouting out to him about a song that he wants him to sing, Famous Blue Raincoat. That's me. I am forever caught on a Leonard Cohen album, and it keeps me very happy and very sweet.
Okay, that's a good story. But look, let me be the cynic for a minute then. As we're getting on in time here, but we've still got 10 minutes maybe. Being a cynic. Okay, Aung San Suu Kyi is sitting next to you. She didn't concede that she or her country had done anything wrong. She's not in jail. What I suppose I'm getting at is that you think that the sorts of work that you've been involved in can point to successes, can point to impact on that awful world that there is out there.
Look, I said again, I'm not starry-eyed about the idea of justice. The folk of Belfast on all sides of the story know exactly what I'm saying about the challenges of doing justice in the context of conflict, and how one puts the bright light of scrutiny on terrible things that have happened over many decades. And we know that the law alone and criminal process and formal justice can never deliver adequately or completely in relation to the totality of a story. So part of the function of the justice system, apart from delivering, the imprisonment of human beings, is to allow stories to be told. Part of what's going on with these cases is to create mechanisms by which the things that happened emerge and are talked about, and over time inform how we think about things. In other words, I suppose what I'm saying is I'm not a believer in the absolute centrality of formalized criminal justice. I learned in South Africa, I learned in Chile, which is where the next book in the trilogy is going to go, that formalized criminal justice has a role to play, but it's not the central role. You need truth, you need reconciliation, you need means for people to tell the stories. The one thing we definitely know, and it's the double theme of East-West Street and the Ratline, is silence is not an answer. Pushing things under the carpet does not make things go away. You know this in Northern Ireland better than anyone in the world. They continue to fester, and in some way and by means unknown, they will emerge. In a sense, the Ratline is a micro of that story. I don't want to give it away, but you know, because you've read it, what happens at the end of the book, the surprise that emerges when there is a conflict between different members of the Wächter family as to what happened. So one generation or two generations telling their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is why dad was a great guy, this is why granddad was a great guy. Actually, if dad or granddad wasn't such a great guy, at some point that is going to emerge. And some sort of crooked truth will emerge, which throws a spanner in the works, and the family has to engage with that. I mean, one of the themes, I think, of the Ratline is that we think of justice in terms of communities as a whole, countries, regions, towns, groups, but actually, in the end, I think the most important group for all of us is the family. It is within the family that the truth lingers, sometimes unspoken. And I think one of the things I've wanted to show with the Ratline is that once a crack appears and information starts emerging, it's impossible to put the lid back on it. And what emerges weaves its magic and transforms the engagement of the present generation with things of the past. The simple point I suppose I'm making, and why I was so keen to do this conversation with you, and why Belfast is so important for me, is that I've understood this when I've been in Belfast. The idea that you can, as the British government sort of wants to do now, push everything under the carpet and say, look, that was then, let's forget about it, let's draw the line. No. That is not how life works. Even if you say you're doing that, it won't happen. It will continue to trickle through. And the Ratline shows how that happens by unexpected means.
Again, I'm thinking of another connection. You mentioned South Africa, the slogan that they had in South Africa, no rope as long as time. So time does bring it all out. Look, we're running out of time. You presaged a question that I wanted to ask. What's the third book? Can we have any sneak previews?
Yeah, you can indeed, you can. Just as, well, you're a very attentive reader, Bill, so you will have noticed that Otto Wächter is a minor player in East-West Street, very minor. There is a very minor player in the Ratline. You remember when Wächter arrives in Rome and the religious gentleman, one of the curiosities of the research was that the Wächters never gave names for anyone in their letters while he was on the run. So we had to a lot of detective work. It took 4 years to uncover the identities. But the religious gentleman parked Wächter in a monastery, the Vinya Pia monastery, and he occupied a monk's cell, which had recently been vacated by an old comrade, quote unquote. If you hear the words old comrade, you now know that always means SS intelligence officer. Anyway, the old comrade who had recently vacated the monk's cell in the Vinya Pia monastery made his way to Damascus, Syria, wrote a long letter to Otto Wächter, which I've got, telling him Syria is not very good for Germans. They're all, disorganized, and the German approach does not work well in Syria. He recommended South Africa or Argentina. And Wächter decided to opt for Argentina. Well, this fellow, whose name was Walter Rauf, spent a year in Syria, then made his way to Ecuador, from Ecuador to Argentina, and from Argentina to Chile, where he arrived in about 1958. He worked as a small businessman for about 15 years, and then in 1973, Augusto Pinochet became the new president by coup d'etat, and this man, Walter Rauf, started working as an interrogator, it is said, for Augusto Pinochet. Walter Rauf was the man who invented the mobile gas chamber. And this story wended its way through the Pinochet years until, as you remember, in October 98, Augusto Pinochet came to London, was arrested whilst getting medical treatment in the Harley Street Clinic, and a case began as to whether he had immunity, unbelievably, for crimes against humanity and genocide, the subject of East West Street. And that case landed on my desk. So the third book in the trilogy will be the story of Walter Rauf and the trial in London of Augusto Pinochet, directly connected to Lemberg, Frank, and Wächter.
Philippe, put my name down. I will buy a copy, sight unseen. We're going to have to end it here. If this was the real world and the real Féile, there'd be a ton of other questions, and they wouldn't just be from one person, namely me. There'd probably be lots of milling around afterwards. If you'd brought copies of both books, you would have sold them out. And I'm sorry you can't get that benefit from this talk. And we might even have ended up over in Cultalan afterwards for a coffee, or the Beehive for a pint.
Next year.
Philippe Sands, we're out of time, unfortunately. I'd like to thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. You didn't have to. Thank you very much for being the relaxed person that you are to tell us this amazing, wonderful story. And above all, thank you very much for writing these books that are really transformative books. Stay at it. We're all waiting for number 3, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you, Bill. I can't wait to be back in Belfast.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
Slán.